document serializer, in this case the camel case JSON serializer, and inject that. The input parser is a JSON input parser. I inject that. So that's dependency injection. That's constructor injection. And then I call convert format. But the input retriever and document persister are configured down here, where I basically say input retriever, register input retriever. Then I give it a func that returns a Boolean, basically telling you whether or not this is the one that you want to use, based on if the path starts with HTTP, then I want to use this one. If the path is a blob storage URL, which is this logic down here, I want to use this one. If in all other cases, use the file storage one. For register document persister, it's the same thing. It takes a func and returns and sets a specific version. Implementation of these are really simple. Basically, it has a dictionary of func taking a string and returning a bool. And it takes an implementation of the I input retriever. And then whenever you request it, it looks at my dictionary and tries to find the first one where it returns true when I execute it, and then I return the input retriever. So even though I'm using a static class and a static implementation, I'm not actually locking myself into anything. I can reconfigure this however much I want. So even though I'm using the input retriever static class, I don't have a dependency on an implementation. I'm still dependent on an interface. So that's one way of doing it. That's the manual way. It does mean that if you want to do constructor injection, you do need to have somewhere where you orchestrate what to put in. You need to create an instance of things and need to inject it into the constructor to get it working. The other way of doing it is by using a service locator. Service locator is another pattern that a lot of people are, how do you put this? Less than happy with, I think is the best way of putting it. The downside with service locator, I'll actually get back to that after explaining how it works. The service locator is kind of an abstract factory like I had before, but in this case, it's actually dependent on an IOC container. So I've created an IOC container. In this case, I'm using Unity to keep track of all of my implementations. So iDocument serializer is a camel case JSON serializer. My input parser should be a JSON input parser. But then I tell, there's a Microsoft patterns and practices thing called the common service locator. It's basically a standard way of doing this. You tell the service locator that the set location provider, and then you tell it, here is my locator, which in this case is a Unity service locator. So it's basically just a way of abstracting our IOC container and not using proper constructor injection in this case. The downside with this, well, there's a massive upside. It means that when I run my program, I just create a new format converter. I don't have to create all of the classes that it's dependent on and inject them myself and everything like that. Instead, this thing in here goes in and says service locator.current to get the current service locator. And then say, can I get an iDocument serializer? And then that will return whatever implementation I've told it to use. And I can say, can I get an instance of input parser? And it will use whatever instance of input parser I've told it to use. So that's quite neat, because it means that I don't have to create all of my dependencies and inject them into the constructor. I can just use them like this. The downside with this solution, I do agree there are a couple of downsides. One is I can't see what this thing is dependent on. Whenever I create an instance of this format converter, if I don't have the source code to go in here and look at what things it's pulling out of the service locator, I won't actually be able to figure out what things is it dependent on. That's a massive downside. The other thing is, if I give him access to the service locator, it's possible for that implementation to go and ask for any interface in the whole system. It can get any service it wants. So it gets access to way more than it actually needs. That's the common thing that people say about the service locator pattern, or you're giving him access to way too much. Who's him? To me, okay, him or it or whatever, if you go, it's giving it too much, it's like, what are you talking about? You mean the class? Yeah, exactly, he gets way too much functionality. It's like, who's building the class? You? Yeah. Yeah, so all you need to do is not pull out things you shouldn't be touching? Just saying. It's about as complicated as that. I do agree with the whole you can't see what it needs, so it is a problem. But there are scenarios where this is way easier than doing dependency injection using constructors. Anybody doing MVVM and XAML-based application development? Ever consider how you do dependency inversion within a view model that's created in XAML without not doing it from code behind, which you should never do? It's actually not possible unless you create another little thing on the side that handles all of that for you. But using the service locator, you can actually get up and going without having a view model locator in place. And finally, we have well, I think most used one, using an IOC container. So the IOC container, once again, I've just got Unity configured. I configure Unity with the different implementations, and then up here in my application, my main method, I ask the container, can you please resolve my format converter? The format converter can take things into its constructor, and your IOC container will be smart enough to figure out, okay, so you want a format converter. I've got one of those here. He wants a document serializer and an input parser. And you have previously told me that anybody that wants an iDocument serializer should get one of these, and anyone that wants an input parser should get one of these. So I'm going to create an instance of those and inject them into that class and put it into the constructor and do all of that for you. All you need to do is say, please, can you resolve a format converter for me? That means that we get the nice declarative thing going, this is what I need, this is what you need to set up for me, fix it for me, but the IOC container will actually do all of the resolving for me. And if any of these classes had any other dependencies, it would then figure out what it should create dependency-wise for that one and inject those as well. So you just tell put it into the constructor, I need these and these and these dependencies, and the IOC container will fix it all for you. Some people might have noticed that I've got a gray get container here, because that's not actually being used. I'm using get declaratively container. The cool thing with Unity, I think this is cool, some might argue. The cool thing with this is that Unity and a lot of other IOC containers can actually do all of its configuration in XML, in your app.config. So I can actually build this whole application without telling the application in code what versions of things to use. And then I can just reconfigure the whole application by going into my app config and say, I want to switch out this little thing for that little thing. I want to switch out this for that. And it will just figure it out. And next time I start the application, the IOC container will have that new configuration. And I've actually managed to modify how my application works without even having to change any code at all. Woo -woo. That is kind of cool. I think that's kind of cool. People do argue that having config in XML is bad, but it is quite useful in a lot of cases. Benefits? Well, as I said, as soon as you invert your dependencies, it means that you can actually switch things out and make changes, which is what all the other SOLI means. They're all about being able to switch out bits and pieces without making a whole bunch of code changes to your existing code. And with dependency inversion, you make that possible in a nice way. Whether or not you choose to use an IOC container or you choose to use a service locator or do poor man's injection or whatever you choose, I don't really care, but just make sure that your classes are not dependent on specific implementations, because it will bite you at the end, I promise you. Some things to consider. Over-engineering and premature optimization. If you go and build a big system from scratch, and you start thinking about Solid from day one, you're going to have so many classes and so many interfaces and so many weird permutations of how your application could work that it's just ridiculous. And you might not need it. Keep that in mind. It's all about drawing a line, and saying, this is how far I want to go. I don't need to break it down further than this, because I don't need it. So you need to take solid together with KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. Or keep it stupid simple, but whatever you want. Don't go too far. And just, as that little thing said, should everyone just be looking at abstractions? Should nobody implement it? Yeah, that's where I'm saying draw a line. This is how far I want to go. We might need to refactor it in the future and add this in later, but don't do it from the beginning if you don't need to. Readability. That's a double-edged sword. Once you go through with solid, your classes become really small, clean, simple to read, simple to understand, and everything is good. But once you start adding abstractions and interfaces and base classes and abstract base classes and stuff like that, figuring out what's actually happening inside of your application becomes really hard. Because all over the place, you're dependent on interface this and interface that and interface this and interface that, and you have no idea until runtime what is actually being called. ReSharper, I don't know if it's in Visual Studio yet. I always put in ReSharper on my machine. Control F12 will take you to a specific implementation. So if there are more than one implementation of an interface, for example, it will tell you these are the implementations you can go and have a look at. If there's only one, it will jump straight there, while F12 will just take you to the interface. Debatability. Prepare yourself to have long, heated debates at the office. I suggest taking a course, anger management to begin with, and a couple of Vicodins before you go to work. No, seriously, there will be discussions regarding this. They tend to become quite heated because it's kind of religious how far you take this. But also, anything that's debatable, where there's not a single answer, means that there are several ways to solve it. Try to find one that works for you. If it doesn't work, then refactor and redo. It's not more complicated than that. Anybody want to guess what the 50 versus 230 is? What? Lines of code, exactly. That is my application. It started out with 50 lines of code. It is now 230 lines of code, not counting the added functionality. Or somewhere in that neighborhood. I did a very quick calc on it. But basically, it went from 50 to 230 without adding any form of new functionality. This is just the same implementations that I had to begin with. Each little piece of code is easy to understand and easy to manage, but there's still 230 lines versus 50 lines. Once again, draw a line. Once in a while, you have to step over that line, but try and sort of go, this is as far as I want to go. There's an awesome blog post somewhere online that I saw once going hello world in the console app. Basically, console.writeline hello world. And then he starts adding all the abstractions and everything on top of it and adding solid. And it turns out being something in the neighborhood of like 20 classes, 16 interfaces, and it looks like this massive thing. And at the end, it writes hello world. So a bit of related content. I thought they would put in I'll be there, and I thought they would put that in. First of all, there's a deep dive into dependency injection. As I mentioned at the beginning, the stuff that you saw with vNext of ASP.NET and that's .NET stuff, it will have a lot of dependency at its core. So I do suggest that you go and have a look at the dependency injection stuff with Miguel. So he's going to do a full session on only that part. I was about to say that principle, but it's not actually going to be talking about dependency inversion, but dependency injection. Keeping that very separate. So that can be a good one. I'm going to be at the Microsoft Solution Experience thingamajig in the halls A and B or whatever it is. Down at the expo, there's a Microsoft area. I'll be there on and off. Don't actually know when, but I will be there. If you see me somewhere around, because I will be roaming the halls, just grab me if you have anything to ask or any questions. If you find me, if I'm not at the solution thingamajig, I think my contact information is there, so they can tweet me and tell me to come, and you can ask any questions you want. I'll be here after the presentation if you have any questions as well. You should visit